Today's topic, Kabbalah 101, on Kabbalah 101, the significance, as soon as I get my mouth back, it's the significance of light. And there's something else we'll find out in just a moment. Y'all sit tight. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Kabbalah 101 with Rav Yitzchak Michaelson, also known as Ira, our dear friend. Welcome back to the show, sir. It's a pleasure, as usual. Always good to have you as often as possible, so thank you for coming.
Pleasure.
Did you just say it's a pleasure to have me? Yeah.
Sounds like some.
Exactly. For a split second there, I thought I had Tovia on the line here. All right. Good deal. Good deal. Okay, tell us tell us the title, that what it should be, where I keep stumbling on.
My buddy is here right now. Well, he's not here in the north, but he's here in Israel.
Right. You going to be able to see him?
I believe so. Yeah, he said he was going to come up north, so we're just trying to figure out when that's going to happen.
Right. That's awesome. That's good. Glad to hear that. So, okay, so tell the viewing audience what the title is, the proper title, because I couldn't get it out of my mouth for some reason.
Kabbalah 101 and the demonic forces of light and darkness.
Hey, speaking of that, guys, come on. The viewers out there, I've been seeing comments, right, on YouTube. This is after we already clarified that it's not at all what you think it is. It's like, somebody will see the title and they won't even watch the video. They'll just say, "This is demonic. You guys are going way off the deep end here, fellas." And I'm thinking, did you even watch episode 1? Did you find out what this actually is that we're talking about? So before you do that, before you make any comments, go check out episode 1, and then you can kind of follow along after that. So maybe this particular show isn't one you just want to jump in the middle of. Maybe you do want to start this one on episode 1 and go to 2 and 3, watch it in a series. So maybe not. Maybe it's up to you guys. So, all right. Well, Rav, let's get moving, and you can just tell me what I need to do on my end as far as bringing up scripture. Or I've got the Zohar here for last week's parsha and also this week's parsha. So I don't know if that's going to help you much, because you said that my copies aren't exactly the best ones to get.
No. What I'm okay. The only reason I brought that up was because of to kind of tie together. Some of the comments you're getting from people. One of the things that I said was that I wasn't a fan of it, only because what they start out by saying is that, even if you can't read and understand Aramaic, it's okay. Just scan the pages and look at the words, and you'll receive energy from it. Now, there's no question that there's great wisdom and there's energy to be received, not just from the Holy Zohar, but from the Torah, which the Zohar goes into. Actually, very interestingly, in this past week's Torah portion, Toldot, it really goes into the concept of the importance of Torah in creation, and how Hashem, how the Creator used the Torah to create the world, and how the study of Torah is the foundation of the world, is one of the pillars that keeps the world, in balance. So for somebody who doesn't understand Kabbalah, to say it's demonic, they're basically saying that here's the Creator using this wisdom, saying that it's through this that He created the world, and it's through this that He keeps the world in balance, and you consider that demonic. Well, fine, if that's what you want to believe, that's fine. But usually this is, like you said, this is coming from people that it has nothing to do with listening to me. It has nothing to do with whether or not they watched the first show. It has to do with whether or not they have any understanding whatsoever of how Torah works, of how the world works, of how creation works, of how Hashem works. Now, a lot of people think they do, and I'm sure that the majority of people that are making comments like this are people who are carrying around baggage from their past
certainly
religious experiences, and now they're coming out and and of course they were experts when they were in that false religion. They were experts back then. They knew everything there was to know.
Right.
As you're going around trying to convince the rest of the world to believe as they did, and now suddenly they find themselves having been lied to for years and years, and now they're going to come out and they're going to look at something that I do, or something that the Ramban, who was writing 700 or 800 years ago in great wisdom, one of the sages of Judaism, and say that what we're doing and what we're the wisdom that we're trying to impart is demonic.
Right. Yep.
Okay, I'll leave you to my Heavenly Father on that one, and B'ezrat Hashem, God willing, he can reveal things to you. Anyway, what we were going to talk about was not just the significance of light, but the significance of light and time. I think we had talked about, I believe I brought up the concept of the supernovae 1987A that had appeared on the morning of February 24th, 1987, if I'm remembering my dates correctly. And what it was this fluky kind of thing, because the scientists that were mapping out the stars and so forth, and looking through the telescope and taking photographs, saw this, what they thought was something on the last photograph. They were actually getting ready to shut down for the night, and then saw this on the last photograph, and went outside, and not only was it on the photograph, but they were able to visibly see this. And rather than it being because it was such a bright light, and rather than it being the birth of a star, what they were seeing instead was the death of a star. The reason I brought it up is because in the last show, I think we talked about it, and I asked the question about this concept of time as it relates to that supernova, because it actually was 160,000 light years away. And that means that basically it took 160,000 years from the time that star exploded for that light to be visible in the sky on the morning of February 24th, 1987. And I think I asked the question of how was that possible? How could it be 160,000 years pass? And we kind of can ask the question, like, could a Neanderthal man be looking up at the sky, 160,000 years ago, and have seen that? Now, I'm going to preface something, because now remember, we're talking about 160,000 years, and people are going to say, "Wait a minute, Rabbi, you're a Jewish Orthodox rabbi, and we know that the Earth is only 5,778 years old. So how is it that you're positing that this happened 160,000 years ago?" I think we might have touched on a little bit the idea of what took place in Genesis, and made the distinction between the time, the 5,778 years, which started when God breathed the neshama into Adam. And that started that process of what we know as the 5,778 years, because the Talmud talks about there being human-like creatures that existed previously, but yet did not have a neshama. They didn't have a soul. They might have had a nefesh, but they didn't have the nishmat chaim. They didn't have that elevated soul that each one of us is given from the time of Adam, when Hashem breathed life into him. So,
gotcha.
So I needed to make that distinction, so that people are saying, "Well, what are you talking about? 160,000 years?"
Okay.
So, and I asked the question based on the speed of light. I said, of course, it's impossible for any, in our technology today, we don't have the ability to travel at the speed of light. But I did ask the question, and I said, let's say we had a ship that we could get into, and we could leave at exactly the same time as that star exploded, and travel at the speed of light along with that light that was traveling. And we both arrived on February 24th, 1987 in the morning at exactly the same time that supernova became visible in the sky. How much time would have passed? And I answered that by saying absolutely no time would have passed. And people find it hard to wrap their head around that because they don't have an understanding of the significance of both light and time and how they interact with each other, not only first and foremost from a scientific standpoint, but then in the Kabbalistic concepts. So you really have to first address this from a scientific standpoint, which is why the series that I'm writing is called The Science of Kabbalah, because I deal heavily with the idea of the science of this so that people can get a good foundation and a base for the understanding. And I also always like to say from the beginning that so that nobody, in the same way that I make the distinction about that 6,000 year or the 5,778 year period, as opposed to the period before that, I am in no way trying to legitimize science. Okay. As an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, we have a Masorah, we have a tradition that we follow from even before Sinai, but of course from the period of Sinai on, we have the Torah, and we follow the Torah, and we follow our Masorah, and we follow the majority opinion. So excuse me, I'm not trying to legitimize science,
right?
But what I'm trying to do is show the science so that when people hear what I have to say and what the Kabbalah has to say and what the great Kabbalists had to say, they can then understand that science is now only catching up to what Judaism has been teaching for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So that's why I think it's very significant that we look at it from a scientific standpoint.
Gotcha. And this is also all very new to me as well. I've not researched it before. In fact, I like many of you out there actually stayed away from it because I was told that it was demonic and I was told that it was not biblical until I started finding things within the text of the Torah itself and in the Tanakh that speak of things that are not explained, that's not explainable, and also does not. Hashem never condemns it either. So again, just to reflect back on the story of Jacob, whenever Jacob and the flocks, where he would actually strip down poplar branches and have these goats mate, and these guys just mysteriously came out speckled, or they came out all solid color, all because of something he did in front of them. That's just that's beyond me, and that's just a tiny example.
And when you're talking about Yaakov, of course, you're talking about you can segue into the idea that in this last week's Torah portion, Toldot, we're just talking about the generations of Yitzchak. It's the whole idea of introducing both Yitzchak and Yaakov and Jacob as well, and the role that Yaakov plays in the whole concept of Kabbalah as well. When you start talking about the patriarchs Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, when we start talking about the Eitz Chaim down the road, the tree of life,
right,
and it have three columns, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov play very strongly into that as the patriarchs to the three columns of the Eitz Chaim, each one of them representing a different one of the attributes of the Creator. For me, it was a very interesting Torah portion because how most people will always say that you open up the Torah and there's something that you see that you've never seen before. You've read it so many times and something strikes you.
Right.
My wife and I are getting ready to celebrate our 21st wedding anniversary this week, and I open up on Shabbat. I'm looking at the Torah portion in the Zohar, and one of the first thing that jumps out at me is the idea that it says, and Yitzchak was 40 years old when he got married. Interestingly enough, my Hebrew name is Yitzchak, obviously Yitzchak Moshe ben Ephraim. My father was Ephraim, and I got married when I was 40 years old.
How cool is that? Nice.
so Hashem kind of led me to that, and I spent a good deal of my time on Shabbat studying Toldot in the Zohar HaKadosh, in the Holy Zohar, and it just is so amazing. Toldot, what Hashem reveals in the Zohar about Torah and creation, and Yitzchak and Yaakov and Avram Avinu, and playing into that. But getting back to the science for a minute, because we'll get to that. I promise, but people are going to have to understand that when we do these shows, that this is such deep wisdom and really uncovers the intention of the Torah. And I said at the beginning, the first show, that I hate that word mysticism, because it's not about mysticism. It's about uncovering the intention of the Torah, really getting deep down into what Hashem is really trying to reveal to us. So that if it seems like we're taking our time and we're going over concepts maybe over and over again, it's because these concepts are very deep, that we need to discuss them, because even for me, some of the scientific information, while it's not necessarily new to me, it can be very difficult to wrap your head around when you start talking about the significance of light and time, when you try to make sense of it from a scientific standpoint, because I know I'm not a physicist. I do the best that I can in trying to bring the wisdom that the Creator gave me and trying to impart it to others for one reason and one reason alone. It's not certainly anybody that knows me. It's not for kavod. It's not for honor. It's not for glory. It's certainly not for money. Mm-hmm. It's because in the Kabbalah, the main function of the Kabbalah is transformation, and the second thing that I would say, besides transformation, meaning in transforming ourselves from within, is perfection of the world, is bringing redemption through what's called the raising of the holy sparks, okay, which we will also talk about at some point.
All right, before we get too far along, would it be okay for people to pop in questions from time to time, or do you want to just stick on point so that you don't forget where you're headed, or?
I don't mind if people pop in a question here, as long as it tries to stay relevant to what we're talking about at the moment. If you kind of feel it's going to take us down a bunny trail,
right? And of course, you have you can just say, I mean, any question that I think may be pertaining to it that maybe you don't, we can just say we'll just send you an email, and then you can correspond with them privately.
Right, or it may be something that I will say that we're going to get to down the road, and we're jumping a little bit too far ahead of ourselves.
Okay, so this I'm going to squeeze one in real quickly. Shmuel, actually just Mimi on YouTube, wanted to know if there's any truth to the Bible codes supposedly given by Vilna Gaon. It says, in particular, says that he, through those Bible codes, said that Jesus was a false prophet. I don't know how much of that you wanted to answer, or all of it, none of it, whatever you want to do. Just want to read that out for you.
I'm not a big fan of the Bible codes. I haven't done a lot of research into it because I don't believe that. I believe that if you, like anything, and we're going to talk about the kind of difference between theories and laws as it relates to science and Kabbalah. Something can start out to be a theory and then become a law, and then we learn down the road that somebody came up with something new, and so that law that they thought was a law wasn't really a law and gets demoted back down to a theory again. That happens a lot in science. I say that to say that when you start discussing the Bible codes, from a mathematical standpoint, you can plug in any kind of formula you want into the Torah and have it come up with what you want it to say. I think the Torah speaks for itself. I think the Torah speaks for itself as to who Yashka was. And I don't see any reason that there would need to be some kind of encoding in the Torah for us to know that he was a false prophet. I think Deuteronomy 13 gives us all the information we need to show us he was a false prophet without having to say, let's go to the third letter of every word in the fifth sentence, or however.
Right.
They tend to, but I also have not done enough research in what the Gaon of Vilna had to say related to Bible codes. I haven't done enough research in that to make a comment, but certainly he was, one of the great tzaddikim of Judaism. So,
okay.
I certainly wouldn't discount anything he said, but okay. I'm not sure that I've ever read that about him or him making a statement like that. So,
gotcha.
I would have to see the source that the person is quoting before I would comment on it.
Okay, gotcha. That makes sense. All right, so I was wondering, should I open the phone lines or just let the questions come in through text only?
No, through text is fine.
Okay,
because,
that sounds good.
I don't. They get too far off.
Right, that's good. Okay, very good.
So what I started to say was that really the only way to, and I'm sorry if I'm rubbing my hands, but winter is starting to come.
That's all right.
It's cold. I live in one of the old Crusader homes, so they're like caves, and they not only retain they kind of stay cool during the summer, but they also stay cold during the winter. So, and we're starting to get colder weather here at night. So,
gotcha.
I think we're an 8-hour difference between us now. So, anyway, so the only way really to make sense of the concept, to understand the science of light in what we were talking about this 160,000 year period and the speed of light and so forth, is to really look at how light interacts with time. Okay. And in the last several centuries, it was really impossible to understand the science of light. And then what happened was there was this short window of time where science came out with these several different discoveries that were made that kind of, at least from a scientific standpoint, made it easier for us to understand the nature of light and its properties, its physical properties. Of course, we know that the light we experience comes from the sun and from stars in our universe. And initially, there was a Scottish physicist named James Maxwell. And it was Maxwell, he was one of these guys within that window of time that we're talking about in these discoveries, where he determined that electricity produces magnetism. He's actually the guy that coined the phrase electromagnetic. I think some of these things are interesting because a lot of the research that I did from a scientific standpoint, opened up, like I never knew that before. I never knew who came up with the idea of electromagnetic or magnetism and so forth. But it was this guy Maxwell, who was a scientist, and a physicist. So he was the first one to coin that phrase, because before that, they were seen as completely separate from one another. And yet he came up with this discovery that it was electricity that produces magnetism. And as a result of that research, that's when science uncovered what they considered the dualistic nature of light. And really what it is that the simple explanation that they came up with is light is made up of both electric and magnetic energy. So it has this dual kind of a duality to it. Because there are photons of light that travel to us from the sun and stars in two ways, also in a duality, as both particles and waves. Now, what's interesting to me is, from a Kabbalistic standpoint, is that we see dualities all the time, not just in science, but we see dualities in Torah. Why? Because we're talking about the duality in doing a show like this. Because there is the revealed Torah, and there's the concealed Torah. So what's revealed to us, obviously, is we have things like the Tanakh, we have things like the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah, and what we would call the concealed Torah would be what we're learning now, which is the Kabbalah, which is the Zohar Kadosh, the Holy Zohar. So these dualities, again, what I'm trying to do is not only show this, what I like to call the narrowing the gap between spirituality and physicality, or between science and spirituality, this narrowing of the gap, but how there are things in science, in other words, I'm saying it the opposite. A scientist would say, oh, look how they mimic us. It's really the opposite way. Look how science mimics what we already know to be true. That the dualities that exist within science are something that were pre-programmed into the universe by a creator. That's the big problem that scientists have. And this is where they get caught up in this whole idea of what I talked about before, theories and laws, for instance. Because if you were to talk to a scientist about creation, for instance, you would get into the whole argument, or I would certainly, with a scientist, over the concept of evolution versus creationism. And for me, even though I'm not a physicist, and even though I'm not a paleontologist, and even though I'm not a scientist, I could easily destroy the arguments that they come up with for the idea of evolution, because they're the very notion, we know from our own Torah in Genesis that the world was created out of chaos. Okay, it says that very clearly. When we look at the idea of creation in the beginning of Genesis, when it says tohu vavohu, that the world was formless and void, one of those words actually, more literally, tohu relates to the idea of chaos, that the world was formed out of this chaos. What science wants us to believe is that there were these random mutations that took place over billions of years, that somehow, whatever, amoebas or single-celled organisms, somehow through these random mutations over billions of years suddenly became human beings. And the truth is that they don't even have, the, what's the word I'm looking for? They don't even have the documentation. They don't have the fossil records. They don't have anything to support it. It actually, what's so silly about it is it takes more faith.
Right.
Just like I said before, it takes more faith to believe what science is trying to teach than it does to believe what the Torah is teaching us.
That's a great point.
Right.
Absolutely.
So, and I don't understand why people don't get that. Mm-hmm. That it requires more blind faith, and this should go out to those people that don't understand the Kabbalah and they're making ridiculous claims against it, because they certainly understand the concept of blind faith. So I'm going to revise my statement and say it would take more blind faith to believe in what science is teaching than what the Torah very clearly reveals to us.
Right.
You know, Albert Einstein, who was one of the greatest minds of our generation, you know, was one of the people who tried to make sense of the duality that related between, you know, this idea of electromagnetism, or this duality of light being both in waves and particles. And what he did was he tried to come up with this idea that particles were photons, and it was only a flow of photons that were a wave. And this is how he made sense of the contradiction, because this is what ends up happening. There are like a lot of contradictions that you find in science. So I talk about this in the written course that I'm doing for Perkei Shoshanim, called The Science of Kabbalah.
Real quickly,
things.
Do me a favor real quick, because somebody commented on YouTube earlier asking if you taught classes. And so with that said, and you just talking about the courses that you're talking about, how can these people contact you for those specific courses?
All right, so the Science of Kabbalah as a course is coming out in volumes. Generally, each volume is somewhere between 30 and 40 pages. The first volume and some of the material that we're talking about now is in that first volume. It is available on Amazon now, and volume 2 just went. Was the editing was completed? It was sent to the team this past week. So God willing, it should be up this week on Amazon. Volume 2 should be up. Okay. I'm about a third of the way through volume 3 right now. The plan is that in addition to what I'm doing with you, I just filled in for Tamar Yona on Israel News Talk Radio and did 3 shows. Mazal Tov to Tamar. I don't know if she listens to the show, but if she does, Mazal Tov, because her son got married last week, and so I was able to fill in.
Nice.
So she go to the Sheva Brachot and not have to worry about it. So we're in negotiations into whether or not I'm going to continue doing a show called The Science of Kabbalah, where I'll be doing this material. But in addition to that, there's a plan for me to do these teachings directly from the course. So in other words, if I get enough feedback from people that want to learn this material, then I will start broadcasting. We just opened up a center in Kikar Maganim, which is the main little square of Tzfat, of the old city of Tzfat. So people who have ever visited here know what I'm talking about. So we have a center. I'll have a full studio set up there. We have a radio station already set up there. My partner, Pesach, has been in radio as well for many years and has his own internet radio station. So the plan is to make that available to people, that people can buy the course volume by volume, and then I will teach from it and then give further insight as we go through each one of the volumes. Made it very affordable for people to either buy it on Kindle. I think the Kindle version, each volume is maybe $2.99, and I think the actual printed version is $6.99 for each one of the volumes. So we're trying to keep it affordable for people.
Nice. Yeah.
Just know that some people prefer to have the written word in their hand as opposed to the digital, so that's why we're doing it in both.
I'm the same way, for sure.
Right. So if people wanted to contact me personally, I will do it at the end of the show, but since we're talking about it, Rav Yitzchak, RAVYITZCHAK, Rav Yitzchak at scienceofkabbalah.com. Science of Kabbalah, no spaces, Kabbalah spelled with 2 B's, KABBALAH.
I'm typing this down. Say they get Rav Yitzchak, so RAVYITZCHAK.
JK at scienceofkabbalah.com.
Okay. Yitzchak.
And the web scienceofkabbalah.com. So if they can also, there's a link on the website to Amazon if they want to go there. And also see some of the other material that we have, because I also, in my relationship with the Yeshiva Perkei Shoshanim, I also have made available through the website the full Shulchan Aruch program. There's something for everybody on there for Jews that want to go deeper into the study of Shulchan Aruch. We have a full programs on Shulchan Aruch. We have a full Noahide course for people that want to learn the Noahide laws. Not just by reading a book, but knowing what the sources actually say in the Torah, in the Talmud, about the Noahide laws. We have a course on keeping kosher. We have a course on the Shabbat kitchen and keeping Shabbat. We have a course on learning, not learning the Hebrew, learning Hebrew to speak Hebrew, but diktuk, like learning being able to read biblical Hebrew, and so learning how to read it and learning the not vocabulary, grammar, okay. Hebrew grammar.
Gotcha.
I'm sorry, my mind works in too many languages at one time. So
that's funny.
Trying to remember words.
Okay,
no, it's one of the things about living in Israel is your mind. You have the language goes back and forth, and it's like your brain switches back and forth between languages. So
let me confirm, because I typed this up and I put it on YouTube, so I need to make sure I got it right. Okay, so RAVYITZCHAK at science SCIANCE of KABALLAH.com.
No, KABBALAH.com.
So one
Two
L,
B.
one L, not two.
Yeah. Two B's, one L.
Oh, okay, got it. That's where I messed up. Okay, good deal. I'm glad I asked. Okay, go ahead and continue, sir.
Yeah. So, when we were talking about the course, so one of the things that I do is I bring in some quotations from physicists, scientists, and I also make recommendations to people. If you've never read the works of Dr. Gerald Schroeder, I highly recommend it. Dr. Schroeder, I had him on my own radio show several years ago. Dr. Schroeder is not only an MIT physicist, but he's a Talmudic scholar. So, and he's written many, many books. You can actually even go to YouTube and see some of his older talks that he did on YouTube. Sometimes the quality is not so great, but I would really recommend, and I quote from it often, and one of his books is called The Science of God, where he brings in a lot of the concepts that I talk about here as well, related to the different scientists. So one of the people that I quote is an author named Brian Greene, who wrote a book called The Elegant Universe, which is also an interesting book if you want to learn the scientific side of things. And he states in that book, The Elegant Universe, he says, the microscopic world demands that we shed our intuition that something is either a wave or a particle and embrace the possibility that is both. We can utter words such as wave-particle duality. So I only bring that up because this is something, again, where years before, what was a contradiction in science now suddenly has become a theory. And then from a theory, they turned it into a law. So before they had ever even thought about the concept of magnetism, or the fact that electricity produced magnetism, or the fact that light had this duality to it in being both waves and particles, these were all just, it had no impact on them. And then suddenly somebody came up with a discovery, and then it went from electromagnetism to Einstein talking about photons, and then flows of photons, and then this idea of wave-particle duality. So the truth is that while Einstein had his theory, and as brilliant as all of the scientists in the world are, no one really understands it or can explain it. Science has no problem efficiently harnessing electromagnetic energy, and yet for them to try and explain it becomes a difficulty for them. And this is why I always bring up that point that it takes more blind faith to believe what they have to say than to believe in the Torah. Yet when you think about it, they've been at the forefront of creating, much of the technology that we have that we take for granted every day, that's based on this harnessing of electromagnetic energy. But at the same time, the world of science almost daily has to come with terms with how mysterious and paradoxical the physical world is. But the point is that it's no surprise to people like us. Or when I say people like us, I'm talking about people of faith. And those who accept that science is simply unwilling to recognize that the gap is narrowing. When I talk about the gap narrowing, I'm talking about the narrowing between physicality and spirituality, or between science and spirituality. They just don't want to accept it. But every day that they come up with a new concept or a new theory, they get closer and closer to becoming people of faith. And certainly if you listen to somebody like Dr. Schroeder, he certainly wasn't always a person of faith. He wasn't an FFB. He wasn't a from birth kind of guy. He was a guy that came up and, like I said, went to MIT and became a physicist and so forth. So to hear him combine the two is really masterful. So I would highly recommend that people either Google him if you've never heard of him and never listened to any of his material, or to check out some of his books on Genesis and the Big Bang, on the science of God, and so forth. Now, I already said, in the world of spirituality, we already have the concepts of what's hidden and what's revealed. And we also have that same thing within the concept of Kabbalah, both a hidden light and a revealed light. Now, what's interesting to me is that a similar concept exists within science when discussing light. Is when you take into consideration the dualistic nature of particle and waveforms, like we just talked about, and the way in which it mimics the hidden and revealed in spirituality, it's based on measurement, meaning that what do I mean by this? That light only reveals itself according to one of these two features at a time, but not both simultaneously. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that when light reveals itself to us in science, it will only reveal itself to us as either a wave or a particle, but not a wave and particle at the same time. So it's astonishing to learn that if measured in waveform, that's how light will be revealed. And yet, if measured as particles, it will only reveal itself in that way as well. So I find that very interesting and astonishing. And down the road, it'll make more sense to people. So after the discoveries were made about light, the world of physics realized that another one of the building blocks of all matter exhibited the same type of paradoxical duality. And what was that? It was the term atoms, not atoms like Adam, A-D-A-M, but atoms, A-T-O-M-S. And that atoms also display the same wave-particle duality that we talked about with light. So consider that from the largest supernova to the smallest particle, everything made of matter is made of atoms that exhibit the same phenomenon we described about light. But that's not where the discoveries ended, because then you get into the whole concept of this idea of the interaction of light and time together. We talked about the supernova, and we started out talking about this 160,000 year period, that 160,000 light year period, that supernova was 160,000 light years away from us. And that it literally took 160,000 years for the light of the death of that star to reach Earth at precisely that time, in precisely that spot, and to precisely be seen by the naked eye in the southern hemisphere. And by the way, it wasn't just visible for that one morning. From my understanding, that was February 24th, 1987. If my memory is correct, that light was visible from February until May of 1987. So you're talking about a 4 or 5 month period that light was visible in the southern hemisphere from the death of that star 160,000 light years away. Wow. It's mind-boggling. So what we know from science is that light travels at the speed of 186,000 miles per second. We talked about the speed of light. So in order to make sense of the amount of time it takes an object to reach a destination, we have to know we have to have certain information. So we have to know whether the destination is moving or is it stationary. So I like to use football as an analogy for this. I don't get to see as much football as I'd like to living in Israel. And of course, football here is considered something else different than what you say football in Israel. Yeah, right. And most people think of soccer. They don't think of American football. Right, got it. That makes sense. No coffee today because I had meat before we did the show. So for all you people that understand the separation of milk and meat.
So you're not talking just coffee, you're talking flavored coffee.
No, this is actually a, what is this? This is vitamin water that I make.
Gotcha. No, I mean the prohibition of milk and meat is not coffee and meat. It's just coffee if you put milk in it or dairy products.
Oh, yeah, coffee, put milk in it. But Well, I could have had cafe Turkey, which is the Turkish coffee, which, excuse me, you don't put milk in, but
Makes sense.
typically I always have a big cup of coffee when I'm talking to you. But I had a meat meal just before we did the show. Actually, when you called me the first time to check in,
Gotcha.
got me stuffing my face earlier. So anyway, I said, so let's use football as an analogy, right?
Yep.
So when the quarterback is throwing the ball to a receiver, the amount of time it takes for the ball to reach the receiver is based on whether he's running towards the quarterback or whether he's running away from the quarterback. So, for instance, the receiver is running a pattern, right? And he realizes that he's in coverage. So then he might run back towards the quarterback to be open to receive a pass. Now, obviously, if he's running towards the quarterback, the ball will reach him much faster than if he's running towards the goal line.
Right.
However, light is not a football, and it's not the same example. So let's get back to the idea of the supernova, for instance. So we talked about the idea of, I already brought up this idea of the Neanderthal peering up the sky 160,000 years ago. Would he have seen the light? You know, what about 5,000 years ago in the Bronze Age? Could someone have viewed the light? And we already talked about this kind of idea of the futuristic spaceship and whether or not we would be able to follow it and see it and how no time existed. So I'm going to bring in a quote from Dr. Schroeder, and this is actually from that book that I quoted, that I said before, The Science of God. And this is what Dr. Schroeder writes as it relates to this, because he's the one that says, as a physicist, he's the one that says that no time existed. And this is what he says about it. He says the difference in the perception of the flow of time at the speed of light is not quantitative difference from a lot of time, meaning that 160,000 years, to a much shorter time, however short that period is. He says the difference in the flow of time is qualitative. The difference between our existence, where all events occur through an unceasing, temporally linear flow, and an existence in which time does not exist. From that perspective, all the developments that took place during that 160,000 years occurred simultaneously. And what he said was past, present, and future had blended into an eternal, ever-present, unending now. Because light is outside of time, which is proven in thousands of experiments and hundreds of universities. So no scientist would argue with that fact that light, and when you're talking about light, that it exists outside of time in essence. So that the conclusion that somebody has to draw from what Schroeder is saying is that, at least as it relates to the speed of light, that light actually exists outside of the realm of time. And that's what Dr. Schroeder would refer to as this eternal now. So remember, if we go back to the very beginning, when we first started talking about scientists, for instance, in the days of Isaac Newton, and we talked about them being theologians, there's no way that they could wrap their minds around the what Schroeder is saying. Why? Because back then they thought the universe was eternal, and the stumbling block in many cases has not really been science but religion, because anyone who's willing to do the research will soon find that, in fact, science and scientists are the ones that are proving spirituality rather than the religionists. We're not the ones that are proving spirituality to be true. They're the ones that are really proving spirituality to be true by these constant things. Why? Because in the days of Newton, they thought the world was eternal. Then we come up with this concept of the Big Bang Theory, which we'll talk about down the road. Schroeder talks about it. Other scientists talk about it. And it doesn't matter whether or not you believe that the Big Bang Theory is true or not. What's interesting about it is the Big Bang Theory destroys the idea of of an eternal universe, and instead teaches, oh, my buddy wanted to get into the picture too? Do you have something to say to us? Oh, he's leaving. I don't know if you could see him in the picture.
Oh, I did see him. He just kind of scanned right past you.
Yeah. So anyway, it really is comical because, like I said, they're the ones that are proving out spirituality. Yeah, if you look back to Einstein's laws of relativity, they not only prove that space, time, and matter are not constant but changing. In addition, it was explained also about he explained the difference between particles and waves and how they are viewed in the way that one chooses to observe them. So really, all of these things come down to a matter of how somebody chooses to observe them. Now, the question I know somebody's going to ask is, why is this relevant? Why is this important? And the answer is, because when you understand this science, you realize that Einstein came up with both theories and laws that have proven to be correct. And one of the most significant as it relates to what we're studying is the fact that the faster one travels relative to another object, like in our make-believe ship traveling alongside that light from the supernova that exploded, the slower time flows. So much so that at the speed of light, which is the highest speed attainable, time ceases. Now, it would even blow people's minds, and maybe we'll talk about it in the next show because I know we only have a few minutes left, is that there are actually scientists that will make the argument that time doesn't actually exist. That that everything that we know as time is really distance. And I don't know if I don't believe I talked about it on this show. I might have talked about it on the show that I did on Israel News Talk Radio, where I talked about the Pythagorean Theory, which is even sometimes I don't think I understand it. But I know I studied it in school, but remember, I'm getting up there in years. So,
gotcha.
But anyway, the Pythagorean theorem really is a mathematical formula, but at the end of the day, they use it to determine, from a mathematical standpoint, whether light or whether time actually we know light exists, whether time actually exists, or whether or not what we're actually experiencing is distance. So, kind of give you a small example of what I'm talking about. An example would be is if you and I decided, as difficult as this would be with me being in Israel and you being in Kingsland, let's say you and I decided tomorrow morning to meet for coffee at 9:00 in the morning.
Right.
And we did meet for coffee. And then we decided while we were having coffee that we wanted to have lunch together and that we were going to meet at noon for lunch. Well, most people would say, okay, it's going to be 3 hours from the time that we had coffee. 3 hours had passed until the time we had lunch. Now, those scientists that would use the Pythagorean theorem to say that time doesn't exist as a dimension would say that really what happened was that based on this Pythagorean theorem and the idea of the speed of light and the way this formula works, that really there was a distance that took place from that coffee at 9 a.m. until that lunch at noon, and that time had absolutely nothing to do with it. That the idea of that 3 hour time really is really based on our need to understand things in our own language, which is not an unusual concept in whenever you're learning Torah and whenever you're learning about the Creator, whenever you're learning about the Zohar, because for instance, we have anthropomorphisms in the Bible, where it talks about the Creator having a right hand or, having emotions and things like that. We know that language is only used for us to try to connect in a way to the characteristics or the character traits or the attributes of a loving Creator, and not meant to really describe him as having any kind of physical form or needs or desires or anything like that. So it's the same thing when talking about science and talking about these kind of concepts of the difference between time and light.
Okay, right. So it's kind of like, so basically what you're saying is that what we know as time is we use that idea of time so that we can understand distance, like almost. I was thinking for a moment, like the nikodot, the vowels. I mean, you don't see them. I mean, you don't go to Israel, you won't see vowels anywhere, but they exist. They're just not there. And so, so is there? I'm trying to connect the dots for myself here.
Yeah, well, because think about it like this. I'm not going to pretend to understand how yesterday, last week, last month, and next year all can exist as what Schroeder described as this eternal now. But in the context of the speed of light, they do.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because this is proven through science that no time passes. We can prove that through the idea of things that we're learning now in modern day science and quantum mechanics and things like that. But all of those things, again, what I'm talking about are things that were described by people like the Ramban, Nachmanides, who was one of the great Kabbalists. You know, he was writing about things like this 700 years ago, when nobody would ever have thought. You know, even the Newtons of the world weren't thinking about these kind of things, weren't thinking about. But now Ramban and the sages might not have called it quantum mechanics or called it wave-particle duality, but they were talking about things like this in spirituality. And as it relates to the Zohar and it relates to Kabbalah, like I said, hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. And so I think before we go into it, because we're almost out of time, it looks like.
Right.
I think maybe we'll talk a little bit about quantum mechanics next time. But I think it's significant that we understand, to kind of leave us on a good note as it relates to Torah and the idea of spirituality, is that consider if you're going to consider the idea of the Big Bang Theory and like supernova 1987A that we're talking about and everything else, and this idea that at one time scientists considered that this world or this universe was eternal, and then came to the startling discovery by their own admission and coming up with the idea of a Big Bang Theory, which I started to talk about before, that then they had to admit that it wasn't eternal, that there had to be a beginning to the universe, which they chose to call the Big Bang Theory, okay? But at the end of the day, everyone has to come to the same conclusion, and I think both science and Judaism certainly agree on this point, even though science might say it in a different way, is to admit that light was in fact the first creation of the universe.
Interesting. Very, very interesting indeed.
We hear Shem say the very first thing that happened after, if you're going to use the Big Bang Theory as the basis, let's say, for Genesis chapter 1, what's the very next thing that happens after this Big Bang, after what scientists say produced all of the elements that were needed to sustain life? Hashem said, "Let there be light."
Gotcha. Wow. So. Very, very cool. Well, so next week, quantum mechanics will be touched on. Next week,
we'll talk about the quantum mechanics and the Big Bang Theory.
Gotcha. The Big Bang Theory, one of my favorite shows.
Yeah. Watch it.
Maybe we could just play, invite Sheldon to come in and host the show for me. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to share this with your friends if you like it. We've got the email address for Rabbi on your screen earlier, so you can go back and just find that. It's easy to find. Also on the YouTube chat, it's there as well. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Shalom, shalom.
תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד, איפוק זו העוצמה